If you dig into London's highest court archives from 1876, you won't find a record of a grand society wedding. You will find a crime scene. A shattered marriage certificate, burned to ashes before the ink could even dry, and a scandal that terrified the British aristocracy. Lady Constance thought she was marrying a man to save her family from ruin. But on their wedding night, her new husband, the powerful Marquis of Ravenscroft, discovered her darkest secret and turned into her worst nightmare. Locking the bedroom door, he growled the words that changed her life forever. "I bought a lady, not an independent woman. Burn your writings, or I will ensure you lose everything." In 1876, a husband legally owned his wife's body, her mind, and her freedom. But Constance refused to be broken. With trembling hands, she did the unthinkable. She threw their legal marriage contract straight into the blazing fireplace, slipped into the shadows, and vanished into the freezing London fog. She chose to become a hunted runaway rather than a silent slave, and this is the story of how she made him pay. For 3 agonizing months, the Marquis spared no expense. He hunted her through the darkest, most dangerous printing districts of the industrial North, desperate to drag his property home and silence her voice forever. He thought he was tracking a fragile woman who would eventually starve and beg for his mercy. He was wrong. Constance wasn't hiding. She was fighting back, running an underground press that threatened to tear his political empire apart. Arthur went looking for a submissive wife, but by the time he finally tracked her down, the proudest Marquis in England would be the one on his knees, begging for mercy on a dirty, ink-stained floor. The crystal chandeliers of Mayfair poured a ruthless, blinding light over the grand ballroom, but to Lady Constance, the warmth felt entirely artificial. Music swelled from the gallery, a sweeping waltz meant to celebrate the union of the season, yet every note sounded like the turning of a key in a lock. She stood beside her new husband, the Marquis of Ravenscroft, her hand resting lightly on his velvet sleeve. To the hundreds of aristocratic guests watching them, she was the picture of serene compliance. A beautiful, dutiful daughter who had successfully saved her family from the gaping maw of bankruptcy. Her silk gown was immaculate, her chin held at the precise angle of high-born grace, and her smile never wavered. But beneath the layers of heavy lace, Constance's pulse raced with a dangerous, secret adrenaline. Less than 3 hours before she walked down the aisle, she had been huddled in a damp alleyway, handing off a stack of freshly penned, radical political essays to a trusted midnight publisher. Those anonymous articles, written under a sharp male pseudonym, were currently tearing through Parliament, systematically dismantling the oppressive labor bills Arthur had spent months crafting. She was his perfect silent bride by night, and his most formidable political executioner by day. Arthur stood tall beside her, an unyielding pillar of old-world conservatism. He possessed a striking, severe kind of handsome that commanded immediate room-wide silence, but his eyes remained entirely cold. When he looked down at her, it was not with the warmth of a groom, but with the sharp, calculated appraisal of a man inspecting a highly prized piece of property. His family's vast wealth had wiped away her father's debts with a single stroke of a pen, and Arthur expected absolute, unquestioning devotion in return. Every time his hand tightened slightly on her waist, it felt less like an embrace and more like a claim of absolute ownership. Constance smiled through the suffocating weight of it, whispering the appropriate pleasantries to passing duchesses, all while imagining the fury that would erupt in Westminster tomorrow when her latest column hit the morning papers. As the midnight hour struck, the celebration wound down, and the reality of her sacrifice closed in. Carriage wheels clattered against the cobblestones as they traveled in a heavy, suffocating silence toward the massive Ravenscroft mansion. Inside the sprawling estate, the air felt thick with history and unyielding rules. Constance was escorted to the bridal suite, a room draped in deep, oppressive velvets that felt more like a beautifully decorated cell than a sanctuary. Her maid helped her unlace the stifling wedding gown, leaving Constance in a simple silk nightgown before slipping out of the room. Left alone, Constance breathed a sigh of relief that was entirely too premature. Seeking a moment of grounding sanity, she unlocked her small traveling writing desk to ensure her notes were secure. Her fingers brushed against a scrap of paper, a stray ink-stained printing receipt from the Radical Press, foolishly left tucked between her blank stationery. Before she could hide it, the heavy oak doors of the bedroom clicked open. Arthur walked in, having bypassed the traditional wait, his cravat already loosened. The dark intensity in his gaze made Constance freeze, her fingers tightening around the receipt. He didn't look like a man arriving for his wedding night. He looked like a predator who had just scented blood in his own home. He closed the distance between them with slow, deliberate steps, his eyes dropping immediately to the hidden desk and the ink staining her fingertips. The silence in the room stretched until it became a physical weight, broken only by the crackle of the hearth fire. Arthur's gaze fixed entirely on the small scrap of paper in her hand. For a second, Constance considered slipping it into her sleeve, but the sudden, sharp narrowing of his eyes told her it was already too late. He closed the remaining distance between them, his heavy boots silent on the plush Persian rug, and reached out. He didn't rip the paper from her fingers. Instead, he took it with a slow, terrifying entitlement, his thumb brushing against her ink-stained skin. Constance held her breath, watching his face as he brought the receipt into the candlelight. She watched the precise moment his mind connected the pieces. He recognized the name of the Radical printing house, the very press currently flooding London with devastating exposes on his family's coal mines. His eyes scanned the dates, realizing with a visible shock that the most recent transaction had occurred just yesterday. Arthur's face hardened into a mask of pure, aristocratic fury. The cold, indifferent groom vanished, replaced by a man who realized he had introduced his greatest political enemy into his bedchamber. He looked from the paper to the ink smudges on her fingers, then to the defiant, unblinking clarity in her eyes. The betrayal hit him like a physical blow, stripping away his carefully cultivated Mayfair mask. Slowly, Arthur turned toward the heavy oak door, stepping back to turn the brass key until it clicked firmly into place. He pocketed the key, isolating them from the rest of the dark mansion. When he faced her again, the soft light of the fire cast long, monstrous shadows across his face. He tossed the printing receipt onto the vanity, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl that cut through the quiet room. He told her he had bought a woman to grace his table and bear his name, not an independent woman with a dangerous mind. He laid down a ruthless ultimatum. She would burn her quills, she would never write another word. Or he would use his immense power to ruin her family completely, stripping away the safety net he had just provided. In 1876, the law was entirely on his side. She was legally his property, and he made it clear he intended to enforce that ownership by any means necessary. Constance felt a cold dread clawing at her throat, but beneath the fear a white-hot spark of rebellion ignited. She looked at the man who thought his wealth could buy her soul, and then her eyes drifted to the mantelpiece, where their freshly signed, legally binding marriage contract sat in its velvet folder. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she made a choice from which there would be no return. With a terrifyingly calm smile, she reached for the contract, pulled the heavy parchment from its casing, and held it directly over the dancing flames of the fireplace. The flames caught the edge of the heavy parchment with a sharp, hungry hiss. Arthur lunged forward, his aristocratic composure shattering into panic as he reached for the burning document. But Constance didn't flinch. She held it in the fire until the heat scorched her fingertips, only letting go when the signatures, The legal bonds that tied her body and soul to the Marquis of Ravenscroft blackened and crumbled into ash. Arthur choked out a curse, using a heavy iron poker to drag the remnants from the hearth. But it was useless. The law that made her his property was now nothing but grey flakes floating up the chimney. When he whirled around, his eyes wild with a mixture of rage and disbelief, the room was already changing. Constance didn't wait for his fury to land. She snatched a thick, dark woolen servant's cloak from the wardrobe, throwing it over her silk nightgown, and bolted for the heavy window that looked out over the courtyard. Before he could cross the room, she threw open the glass. The freezing midnight air rushed in, extinguishing half the candles and filling the room with the scent of rain and coal smoke. Arthur screamed her name, a sound tore from his throat that no one in London society had ever heard him make. But as he reached the ledge, all he caught was a flash of dark fabric, vanishing down the low trellis and disappearing completely into the dense, suffocating London fog. By morning, the grand Ravenscroft mansion was a tomb of forced silence. The Marquis sat at his massive mahogany desk, his clothes unchanged, his jaw set in a rigid, terrifying line. The room smelled of stale smoke and damp velvet. His head of security stood before him, trembling slightly under the weight of the Marquis's gaze. Arthur's instructions were absolute, delivered in a voice like cracking ice. No one could know. To the ton, to Parliament, and to her bankrupt family, the Marchioness was suddenly and deeply indisposed at a remote country estate due to a sudden illness. The scandal of a runaway bride on her wedding night would ruin his political career before the new session even began. But behind the locked doors of his study, the reality was a frantic, invisible war. Arthur poured his immense wealth into the hunt, hiring private investigators and pouring money into the pockets of informants across London. Yet, as the first week bled into the second, a frustrating, hollow truth began to settle into his chest. He searched her favorite bookshops, the parks she frequented, and the homes of her childhood friends, but found absolutely nothing. He realized, with a sickening jolt of vulnerability, that he had married a ghost. He had looked at her for months and seen only a beautiful asset to his social standing. He hadn't looked at her mind. Frustrated and desperate, Arthur returned to her empty, cold bridal suite. He began tearing through her remaining belongings himself, ignoring the maids who watched from the hallway in terror. He ripped open her vanity drawers, overturning perfume bottles and lace handkerchiefs until his fingers hit a false bottom in her jewelry box. Pulling the velvet lining away, he didn't find diamonds. He found a small, leather-bound notebook. He opened it, his heart pounding against his ribs as he stared at the neat, elegant handwriting. It wasn't a diary. It was a coded list of names, addresses, and shipping schedules, all centering around the gritty, industrial printing houses of the smoke-choked north. Constance hadn't just run away to hide. She had run straight toward her true kingdom. The rhythmic, deafening crash of the steam-powered printing presses vibrated straight through the floorboards of the cramped attic, a brutal contrast to the quiet opulence Constance had left behind in Mayfair. For 3 weeks, she had survived in the industrial heart of Manchester, a city choked by a permanent shroud of black coal smoke that tasted of sulfur and rain. Her silk nightgown had long since been traded for a coarse wool skirt and an apron stained permanently with toxic black ink. Her fingers, once accustomed to the smooth handle of silver teacups, were now raw and blistered from hand-setting lead-type blocks for 12 hours a day. Yet, as she wiped a streak of grease from her forehead, Constance felt a fierce, intoxicating sense of freedom she had never known in a London ballroom. Using the last of her hidden pocket money and her deep knowledge of the trade, she had secured a position at a struggling, radical printing collective known as the Whispering Press. The workers here were suspicious of her at first. Her refined accent, despite her best efforts to flatten it, marked her as an outsider. but she had earned their fierce solidarity the moment she sat down and began to write. Working under her established male pseudonym, she poured her fury into the page, crafting devastating essays that exposed the horrific working conditions in the northern coal mines, mines owned almost exclusively by the Marquis of Ravenscroft. She wasn't just hiding from her husband. She was using his own financial empire as fuel for her revolution. 300 miles to the south, Arthur stepped off the midnight train into the freezing, soot-stained station, looking like a dark omen in his heavy tailored overcoat. The past month had hollowed him out. His eyes were bloodshot, his jaw covered in a rough stubble that shocked the valet who had traveled with him. London society still believed the Marchioness was recovering at a seaside manor, but Arthur knew the clock was ticking. If she wasn't found before the opening of the winter parliamentary session, the rumors would turn ruinous. Armed with the coded notebook he had stolen from her vanity, Arthur began his hunt through the labyrinth of the northern industrial districts. But he quickly discovered that his immense wealth and noble title, which commanded instant obedience in Mayfair, were entirely useless here. The working-class printers and factory hands looked at his fine clothes and expensive leather boots with open hostility. When he offered gold for information about a missing high-born woman, he was met with tight-lipped silence or deliberate misdirection. They hated everything he stood for, and they protected their own with a fierce, unbreakable wall of solidarity. Frustrated and flagging, Arthur stopped outside a dimly lit tavern as the midnight bells began to toll. A young boy ran past, hawking the latest midnight edition of a radical underground broadsheet. Arthur bought a copy, intending to toss it aside, but the headline caught the flickering gaslight and made his breath catch in his throat. The prose was unmistakable. It possessed the same razor-sharp wit, the same elegant, devastating cadence that had dismantled his bills in London. He stared at the fresh, smudging ink on the paper, realizing with a sudden electrifying jolt that she was close. He looked up at the dark, winding alleyways of the printing district, unaware that just 2 blocks away, a shadow was watching him from a high window. The dawn light in Manchester was nothing more than a murky grey haze, but inside the cramped office of the Whispering Press, the atmosphere was electric. Constance stood by the window, her breath fogging the glass as she watched the distant silhouette of the Marquis walk down the cobblestone street below. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a wild mix of terror and exhilaration. He had found the city, he was closing in. But instead of packing her bags to flee, she turned back to the typesetting table with a fierce, defiant smile. She had work to do. Over the next 2 weeks, the war between the Marquis and his runaway bride played out across the front pages of the northern broadsheets. Constance weaponized her intimacy with Arthur's political strategies. Every time he tried to coordinate with local magistrates to crack down on the radical presses, a new anonymous column hit the streets the next morning, exposing his plans and mocking his inability to control his own house. Her writing became bolder, sharper, and more devastatingly popular. The working class carried her words like ammunition, and even the London papers began syndicating the mysterious northern writer. Arthur read every single word. Sitting in his bleak, rented hotel room surrounded by maps and half-empty teacups, he became a man possessed. He no longer read her work out of mere anger. He read it with a terrifying, obsessive admiration. Her mind was a brilliant, intricate maze, and he was hopelessly lost in it. He began to realize that his fury at her escape wasn't just about his wounded pride. It was because she was the only person in England who truly challenged him. He knew he couldn't catch her by asking questions, so he decided to outsmart her. Arthur visited the local ink merchants, using his wealth to buy his way into their ledgers. He wasn't looking for a woman. He was looking for a specific, rare formulation of French midnight blue ink that the writer always used, a luxury Constance had smuggled with her from London. It took 3 days of tireless tracking, but finally a terrified merchant pointed to a warehouse near the polluted banks of the canal. Arthur didn't wait for the authorities. He went alone under the cover of a torrential downpour, his coat soaked, his heart pounding with a desperate urgency. He kicked open the heavy timber door of the suspected warehouse, his hand clenched into a fist, expecting to finally trap her in the corner. The room was vast, dark, and utterly silent. The printing press in the center of the room was empty, the inkstone wiped clean. Arthur rushed to the desk in the back, his chest heaving. The embers in the small iron stove were still glowing orange, throwing a faint warmth into the damp air. Beside a half-empty teapot sat a single crisp sheet of parchment. Arthur picked it up, his hand trembling as he read the elegant, fresh handwriting meant only for him. "You cannot buy a mind, my lord. Look closer." Before he could process the note, the sudden, distinct sound of a heavy iron bolt sliding into place echoed from the outside of the warehouse door, locking him in the dark. The heavy iron bolt clicking into place from the outside felt like a physical slap to Arthur's pride. He hurled his weight against the massive warehouse doors, shouting into the torrential rain, but his voice was swallowed by the roar of the storm and the distant hiss of steam factories. It took him hours of agonizing, frantic labor to pry open a rusted iron grate over a side window, tumbling out into the mud of the canal bank just as the sky began to turn a sickly, bruised purple with the dawn. He was soaked, shivering, and bleeding from a deep gash on his palm, but his eyes burned with a dangerous, single-minded obsession. She had played him. She had baited him into a trap, and she was likely using those precious hours to vanish forever. Arthur rushed back through the waking slums of the city, ignoring the stares of factory workers who looked at his ruined luxury clothes. He knew she would head for the railway station. If she reached Scotland, the trail would go entirely cold. Desperate, he bypassed the useless magistrates and went straight to the gritty docks, throwing handfuls of gold sovereigns at a network of cutthroat informants. His wealth, which had failed to buy respect, finally bought the one thing he needed: greed. Within an hour, a trembling dock worker gave him the true location of the whispering press, not the decoy warehouse by the canal, but a hidden cellar beneath an abandoned textile mill on the northern edge of the district. Inside the damp cellar, the air was thick with the scent of vinegar, lamp oil, and panic. Constance was working frantically by the light of a single tallow candle, her breath blooming in white plumes in the freezing air. The warning had come just 30 minutes prior. An informant had broken under the weight of the Marquis's bounty. The collective was compromised. Around her, 2 young printers were hastily packing essential typeset blocks into heavy canvas sacks, their faces pale with the knowledge that a conviction for sedition meant a lifetime in a penal colony. Constance's hands shook as she reached for her final, most prized possession, the leather-bound notebook containing her future articles. She tied the strings of her servant's cloak tight around her throat, her ears straining against the heavy silence of the street above. She had survived 3 months on her own wit, but as she reached for her satchel, a sudden, violent crash echoed from the top of the cellar stairs. The splintering of old wood cut through the room like a gunshot. The 2 young printers scrambled toward the coal chute in the back, but Constance stood frozen, her fingers clutching the edge of the heavy printing table. The thick oak doors at the top of the stairs were kicked entirely off their hinges, crashing down into the darkness. Through the cloud of dust and splintered wood, a silhouette emerged, stepping slowly down the stone steps. It was Arthur. He was haggard, his face streaked with soot and dried blood, his expensive coat torn to ribbons. But as his cold, piercing gaze locked onto hers through the flickering candlelight, a dark, victorious smile touched his lips. He closed the distance, blocking the only exit, and whispered, "Game over, Constance. The heavy silence of the cellar was broken only by the steady, rhythmic drip of groundwater somewhere in the dark corners. Arthur stood at the base of the stairs, breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling beneath his ruined coat. He looked like a man who had fought his way through hell to get to this room, and yet, as he stared at Constance, his posture straightened into the rigid, terrifying authority of a master reclaiming his property. He expected her to run, to scream, or to cower behind the heavy iron machinery of the printing press. Instead, Constance slowly let go of her satchel, stood up straight, and faced him. The flickering candlelight caught the sharp, unyielding lines of her jaw. There were no tears in her eyes, no trembling in her hands. When she spoke, her voice didn't waver. It was as smooth and lethal as a polished blade, cutting through his arrival before he could even speak a word of command. She didn't wait for his accusations. She immediately launched into a devastating, clinical critique of his latest speech to the House of Lords, picking apart his economic fallacies with the exact same intellectual precision that had humiliated him in the press for the past 3 months. Arthur froze, his reprimand dying in his throat. For months he had told himself he was hunting a rebellious, hysterical girl who needed to be disciplined. But hearing her speak, surrounded by the ink and iron of her true kingdom, the illusion shattered entirely. He wasn't looking at a misbehaving wife. He was looking at his intellectual superior. The realization hit him with a terrifying, intoxicating force. His anger shifted, warping from a desire to punish into a desperate, obsessive need to possess a mind so brilliant. He took a step forward, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper, commanding her to come home, promising that he would overlook her treason if she simply submitted to his protection. Constance laughed, a sound that cut right through his aristocratic pride. She looked around the damp, filthy cellar, then looked him dead in the eye and told him she would rather hang from a London gallows for sedition than live another day as a silent ornament in his gilded cage. She made it clear that the woman he thought he bought on their wedding night had died the moment she threw their contract into the fire. Arthur's hand tightened around the stone wall, torn between the urge to drag her out by force and the paralyzing realization that he couldn't break her spirit without destroying the very thing he now worshipped. Before he could make his next move, a sudden, chaotic noise erupted from the street above. Heavy, hurried footsteps rattled the ceiling boards, accompanied by the harsh clatter of iron truncheons against metal rails. The local watchman, tipped off by the very same informant who had taken Arthur's gold, had arrived. A booming voice echoed down the stairwell, demanding entry in the name of the crown and declaring everyone inside under arrest for radical conspiracy. Arthur whirled toward the stairs, then back to Constance, realizing with a sudden spike of adrenaline that the law he had relied on to trap her was about to destroy her. The heavy thud of the watchman's boots at the top of the stairs sent a jolt of pure panic through the damp cellar. The shouting grew louder, a chorus of gruff voices demanding immediate surrender. For 3 months, Arthur had envisioned this exact moment, the law stepping in to strip Constance of her stubborn independence and force her back into his custody. The local constables were here to do his dirty work. All he had to do was step aside, let them shackle her, and use his immense political influence to have her quietly released into his private care. She would be broken, humbled, and entirely dependent on his mercy. But as he looked across the dimly lit room at Constance, the trap dissolved. She hadn't moved toward the back escape route. She stood entirely still against the iron frame of the press, her chin tilted up, her eyes wide with a terrifyingly calm acceptance of her fate. She was ready to go to prison. She was ready to face a penal colony or a gallows rather than beg him for protection. Arthur realized, with a sickening clarity, that if he let the law take her, he wouldn't be saving her. He would be executing the most brilliant mind he had ever encountered. The heavy wood of the cellar door groaned as the first watchman threw his shoulder against it. Before Constance could process the shift in the room, Arthur whirled around. The haggard, desperate hunter vanished, replaced instantly by the formidable, terrifying aura of the Marquis of Ravenscroft. He strode up the stone steps, his ruined coat billowing behind him like a dark shroud, and threw himself directly into the doorway, just as 3 burly constables burst through the splintered frame. The lead watchman raised his heavy iron truncheon, ready to strike, but froze the moment the flickering light caught the severe, unmistakable features of one of the most powerful peers in Parliament. Arthur didn't give them a chance to speak. His voice cut through the damp air like a cracking whip, radiating an absolute aristocratic authority that demanded immediate, unconditional submission. He demanded to know who gave them the authority to disrupt a private investigation authorized by his own office. He claimed the radical press was a sting operation orchestrated entirely by his estate to root out northern treason, and that any man who stepped foot into the cellar would be stripped of his badge, and tried for interfering with the crown. The watchmen looked at each other, their faces turning pale beneath their leather caps. They looked at the Marquis's bloodied hand, his torn clothes, and the sheer murderous intensity in his eyes. The law in 1876 was designed to protect men of Arthur's stature, not question them. With a series of hurried, stammering apologies, the constables backed out of the doorway, their heavy footsteps retreating up the street until the alley above fell entirely silent. Arthur stood at the top of the stairs for a long moment, his shoulders sagging as the adrenaline faded. He turned slowly, looking down into the cellar, where Constance still stood in the shadows. He had just compromised his political career, lied to the crown, and shielded a radical cell to keep her safe. He stepped down the stairs, extending a trembling, ink-stained hand toward her, expecting that this ultimate sacrifice would finally make her see reason. But Constance didn't move. She looked at his extended hand, then up at his face, her expression hardening into a cold, devastating skepticism. She told him that playing the chivalrous hero changed nothing. She refused to leave with him just because he had used his aristocratic privilege to clear the room, demanding to know if he wanted a wife he could control, or if he was finally ready to face her as an equal. The heavy thud of the watchman's boots at the top of the stairs sent a jolt of pure panic through the damp cellar. The shouting grew louder, a chorus of gruff voices demanding immediate surrender. For 3 months, Arthur had envisioned this exact moment, the law stepping in to strip Constance of her stubborn independence and force her back into his custody. The local constables were here to do his dirty work. All he had to do was step aside, let them shackle her, and use his immense political influence to have her quietly released into his private care. She would be broken, humbled, and entirely dependent on his mercy. But as he looked across the dimly lit room at Constance, the trap dissolved. She hadn't moved toward the back escape route. She stood entirely still against the iron frame of the press, her chin tilted up, her eyes wide with a terrifyingly calm acceptance of her fate. She was ready to go to prison. She was ready to face a penal colony or a gallows rather than beg him for protection. Arthur realized, with a sickening clarity, that if he let the law take her, he wouldn't be saving her. He would be executing the most brilliant mind he had ever encountered. The heavy wood of the cellar door groaned as the first watchman threw his shoulder against it. Before Constance could process the shift in the room, Arthur whirled around. The haggard, desperate hunter vanished, replaced instantly by the formidable, terrifying aura of the Marquis of Ravenscroft. He strode up the stone steps, his ruined coat billowing behind him like a dark shroud, and threw himself directly into the doorway, just as 3 burly constables burst through the splintered frame. The lead watchman raised his heavy iron truncheon, ready to strike, but froze the moment the flickering light caught the severe, unmistakable features of one of the most powerful peers in Parliament. Arthur didn't give them a chance to speak. His voice cut through the damp air like a cracking whip, radiating an absolute aristocratic authority that demanded immediate, unconditional submission. He demanded to know who gave them the authority to disrupt a private investigation authorized by his own office. He claimed the radical press was a sting operation orchestrated entirely by his estate to root out northern treason, and that any man who stepped foot into the cellar would be stripped of his badge, and tried for interfering with the crown. The watchmen looked at each other, their faces turning pale beneath their leather caps. They looked at the Marquis's bloodied hand, his torn clothes, and the sheer murderous intensity in his eyes. The law in 1876 was designed to protect men of Arthur's stature, not question them. With a series of hurried, stammering apologies, the constables backed out of the doorway, their heavy footsteps retreating up the street until the alley above fell entirely silent. Arthur stood at the top of the stairs for a long moment, his shoulders sagging as the adrenaline faded. He turned slowly, looking down into the cellar, where Constance still stood in the shadows. He had just compromised his political career, lied to the crown, and shielded a radical cell to keep her safe. He stepped down the stairs, extending a trembling, ink-stained hand toward her, expecting that this ultimate sacrifice would finally make her see reason. But Constance didn't move. She looked at his extended hand, then up at his face, her expression hardening into a cold, devastating skepticism. She told him that playing the chivalrous hero changed nothing. She refused to leave with him just because he had used his aristocratic privilege to clear the room, demanding to know if he wanted a wife he could control, or if he was finally ready to face her as an equal. If this story has you hooked, if you can feel that slow, gripping tension, go ahead and like, subscribe, and share it with someone who enjoys unforgettable storytelling. New stories drop every day, each one more intense than the last. And before you leave, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I love seeing who's part of this journey. We may be wrapping up here, but the drama doesn't end. If your pulse is still racing, keep it going. The next 2 stories on your screen go even deeper, darker, bolder, impossible to ignore. Subscribe so we stay connected. Then pick one and dive in. Your next obsession is just one click away.